My name is Jane, and 6 months ago, I thought I'd found everything I'd ever dreamed of. Jason and I were in love, the kind of love that felt easy and sure. We laughed, we planned, we built a life together piece by piece. In just 60 days, I was supposed to walk down the aisle and marry the man I thought was my forever. Christmas morning should have been another beautiful chapter in our story. Snow fell quietly outside, the glow of the tree filled the room, and Jason handed me a gift wrapped with care. I unwrapped it, expecting to feel joy, connection, maybe even magic. But as I held it in my hands, something inside me shifted. He smiled, waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't. Because in that moment, a thought struck me so deeply it left me breathless. He doesn't understand me. Not the way I need him to. Looking back now, I wonder, was it really just about that day? Or had the cracks been there all along, quietly waiting to surface? This is the story of why I left. Before we dive deeper into this story today, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this journey, and give this video thumbs up. Your support energized us for sharing these intimate stories, and remember to turn on notifications so you won't miss any future episode. We met on a rainy afternoon, the kind of day where nothing seems to go right. I was late, juggling too many things, with a coffee cup balanced precariously on a stack of books I just picked up from a little bookstore downtown. I wasn't watching where I was going, and before I knew it, I collided with someone. The coffee tumbled down, soaking the books, the floor, and the stranger's shoes. I froze, my face burning with embarrassment. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I stammered, grabbing napkins from my bag, which of course only made things worse. But when I finally looked up, instead of seeing anger or frustration, I was met with the warmest laugh. "Well," he said, glancing down at his now coffee-stained shoes, "this is officially the most exciting thing that's happened to me all day." That was Jason. He had this presence, calm, steady, the kind of person who instantly makes you feel at ease. He bent down to help me pick up the books, completely unbothered by the mess. When I offered to replace the book I'd ruined, he insisted on replacing it himself. "It's only fair," he said, flashing a smile that seemed to light up the rainy day. Before I knew it, we were sitting in a small cafe around the corner. It wasn't part of my plan for the day, I was supposed to be somewhere else, but something about Jason made it easy to forget what I was rushing toward. We talked for hours. About everything. His job in tech, my love for art and design. He told me about the coding projects he was working on, and I confessed how I sometimes sketched strangers I saw on the train. He was practical, deliberate, the kind of person who measured his words carefully. I was impulsive, always jumping from one idea to the next. I remember thinking how different we were, but it didn't feel like a problem. It felt exciting. That night, as I walked home, I couldn't stop replaying the day in my mind. I felt like I'd stumbled into something or someone important. We started seeing each other regularly after that. Every date felt like a window into his world, a glimpse of the life he'd built with so much care and precision. Jason was the kind of person who carried a notebook everywhere, jotting down lists and ideas. On one of our early dates, we went to a museum, and while I marveled at the paintings and sculptures, he spent half the time reading the little plaques about how they were made. I teased him about it, and he just smiled and said, "I like understanding how things work." One time, I suggested we go to the park to catch the sunset. Jason agreed, but not before checking the weather app, calculating the exact time the sun would set, and planning the best route to get there. It made me laugh, how meticulous he was. I was used to going with the flow, trusting that things would work out. He brought a kind of structure to my life that I didn't know I needed. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe, like someone else was helping me carry the weight of the future. And in return, I think I brought a kind of unpredictability to his world. I dragged him to pop-up art shows, late-night diners, and once, on a whim, to a midnight screening of an old black-and-white movie. Jason wasn't used to those kinds of adventures, but he went along with them. I could tell he was trying, even if he didn't always understand why I loved those things so much. There were little moments that stayed with me, like the time we went to a flea market. I got lost in a stall full of vintage jewelry, and when I turned around, Jason was holding up an old camera, testing its shutter. "It's broken," he said, but I bet I can fix it. I watched him examine the camera, completely absorbed, and thought, this is someone who loves solving puzzles. It was one of the things I admired most about him, his ability to see the potential in things. He made me feel safe. Like the world wasn't such a chaotic, unpredictable place. But looking back now, I realize that even in those early days, there were signs. Tiny cracks I didn't notice, or maybe didn't want to see. There was the time I surprised him with a spur-of-the-moment picnic at the park. I'd packed sandwiches, a bottle of wine, and a blanket. Jason showed up with a spreadsheet on his phone, calculating the cost of everything we'd need for a hypothetical road trip I'd mentioned weeks earlier. It was thoughtful, in a way, but I remember feeling off. Like we weren't quite on the same wavelength. And then there was the night we went to a holiday market. I was enchanted by the lights, the music, the little handmade ornaments. I picked up this beautiful glass ornament, shaped like a snowflake, and showed it to Jason. "Isn't it perfect?" I asked. He glanced at the price tag and said, "It's a bit much for something so small, don't you think?" I laughed it off at the time. I didn't want to ruin the moment. For months, I focused on everything that felt right between us. The way he made me coffee in the mornings, always exactly the way I liked it. The way he remembered the little things, like how I hated olives on my pizza or loved thunderstorms. I told myself that love wasn't about grand gestures or fairytale moments, it was about the quiet, steady things. And Jason was steady. Still, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where I wondered if he really saw me. The way I saw him. Those first few months felt like magic. Everything seemed to fall into place so easily. Jason brought a kind of calm to my life, a steadiness that I hadn't realized I needed. And I brought him out of his routines, showing him a world beyond his carefully laid plans. It felt like we were creating something special, a balance that worked perfectly, at least on the surface. I remember our first real date. He took me to this tech convention downtown. It wasn't something I'd ever imagined myself doing, but Jason was so excited about it. As he walked me through rows of booths filled with gadgets and software demos, his eyes lit up like a little kid's. He explained things I didn't understand, patiently, like he wanted me to see the world through his lens. In return, I brought him into my world. One weekend, I took him to an art gallery, hoping to share the thing that made me feel most alive. He stood in front of the paintings with his arms crossed, analyzing brushstrokes and asking questions about technique. It wasn't the reaction I'd expected, but he was trying. I told myself that's what mattered. Jason had this way of surprising me, not in the big, dramatic ways I dreamed about, but in small, thoughtful gestures. Like the time he noticed how my laptop was running slowly and showed up the next day with a new external hard drive. Or when he left sticky notes on my fridge reminding me to drink water because I'd mentioned getting headaches from dehydration. It was practical, sure, but it was his way of caring. Still, there were moments that didn't feel quite right. Moments I brushed aside because I didn't want to see what they meant. I started decorating for Christmas in early November. Twinkling lights, wreaths, candles, our apartment looked like something out of a holiday catalogue. Jason walked in one evening, paused to take it all in, and said, "You know it's just another day, right?" He wasn't being mean, it was just how he saw the world. I laughed it off, saying, "It's not just a day, it's Christmas." But his comment stuck with me longer than I'd like to admit. Then there was the time I planned a beach picnic. It was one of those rare sunny days, and I wanted to do something spontaneous, something fun. I packed sandwiches, fruit, and a bottle of wine, imagining the two of us lying on a blanket, watching the waves. Jason showed up with a spreadsheet on his phone. He'd been working on honeymoon budgets. I smiled, kissed him on the cheek, and told him he was adorable. It was true, in a way. His practicality was part of what I loved about him. But as we sat there, watching the tide roll in, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on two very different wavelengths. It wasn't just about holidays or picnics, either. Jason and I had a way of seeing the world that sometimes didn't quite align. I believed in celebrating little moments, in finding magic in the unexpected. He believed in planning for the big picture, in building a life that was steady and secure. I told myself it was cute, just him being Jason. And I convinced myself that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect understanding. It was about compromise, about appreciating what the other person brought to the table. But every now and then, something would tug at the edges of my mind. A quiet thought I tried to ignore: does he really understand me? It was easy to dismiss those thoughts in the beginning. Jason was so kind, so steady. He never forgot to text me goodnight or check in during a stressful day. He showed up for me in ways no one else ever had. Like the time I had to work late on a deadline and completely forgot to eat. Jason showed up at my office with takeout, a coffee, and a smile. "I figured you'd forget," he said, handing me the bag. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. There were no flowers, no candlelit dinners, but it was practical and thoughtful. It was him. I told myself that's what love was supposed to look like: small acts of care, consistent and reliable. Not fireworks or fairy tales. And yet, there were moments I couldn't ignore. Like when I tried to show him the glass ornament I'd fallen in love with at a holiday market. It was delicate, hand-painted, and it reminded me of the ones my dad used to buy for my mom. Jason glanced at it, shrugged, and said, "It's nice, but it's a bit overpriced, don't you think?" I laughed, brushing it off like I always did. But deep down, I felt a pang of disappointment. Looking back now, I realize those moments weren't just quirks or differences in personality. They were glimpses of something deeper, a disconnect I wasn't ready to admit to myself. At the time, though, I focused on the good. The way Jason made me feel safe. The way he remembered the little things, like how I took my coffee or that I hated walking on icy sidewalks. I told myself that love wasn't about being swept off your feet, it was about building something steady, something real. And Jason was steady. He was real. So I ignored the little cracks, convincing myself that they didn't matter. After all, no relationship is perfect. And in those first few months, it was so easy to believe that ours was close enough. Click subscribe and remember to turn on notifications so you won't miss any future episode. Christmas has always been my favorite time of year. Not just because of the lights or the gifts, but because of the way it brought my family together. My dad had this way of making it magical for my mom every single year. He would surprise her with something thoughtful, something that showed he truly knew her. A song he'd written, a hand-carved ornament, a trip to a place she'd always wanted to see. It wasn't about how much money he spent. It was the meaning behind it. Watching them as a little girl shaped so much of how I saw love. It was about connection, about knowing the person you loved so deeply that every gesture felt personal. I told Jason all of this, hoping he'd understand how much Christmas meant to me. As December rolled around, I threw myself into creating that same kind of magic. I put up lights on every surface I could reach, hung wreaths on the doors, and spent hours arranging candles, garlands, and little touches to make our apartment feel like a cozy Christmas haven. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air from the candles I burned. I even bought a small snow machine and set it up on our balcony, so it would look like snow was falling outside our window. Jason, meanwhile, barely seemed to notice. I tried to laugh it off, teasing him as he worked at his desk while I untangled strings of lights. "You know, it wouldn't kill you to hang a wreath or two," I joked. He smiled, glanced at his laptop, and said, "You're so much better at that kind of thing than I am." I told myself it was fine. Not everyone grew up loving Christmas the way I did. Then came my holiday dinner party. I spent the entire day preparing, baking cookies, arranging a centerpiece, making sure the table was set just right. I wanted it to feel warm, welcoming, like a little slice of the holidays we could share with our friends. Jason walked in just as I was finishing up. He handed me a bottle of wine and kissed me on the cheek. "For the table," he said casually, before heading off to talk to our guests. I stared at the bottle in my hands, feeling something I couldn't quite name. It was thoughtful, in a way. He'd remembered to bring something. But I couldn't help but feel like it was the bare minimum. I wondered if he'd put any thought into it, or if it was just something he'd grabbed on the way home. Later that evening, I overheard one of my friends, Sarah, whispering to another guest. "Jason's nice, but do you think he really gets her?" I don't think they meant for me to hear it. And I laughed it off when Sarah asked if I was okay. But the words stuck with me. A few days later, Jason and I went to a holiday market. It was one of my favorite traditions, the rows of little booths filled with handmade crafts, the smell of roasted chestnuts and hot cocoa in the air, the sound of careless singing in the distance. We stopped at a stall selling ornaments, and my eyes landed on a beautiful glass snowflake. It reminded me of the ones my dad used to buy for my mom, delicate and intricate, like a little piece of winter you could hold in your hands. "Isn't it perfect?" I asked, holding it up for Jason to see. He glanced at it, then at the price tag. "It's nice," he said, his tone casual. "But don't you think it's a bit much for something so small?" I felt my chest tighten. I smiled, nodded, and put the ornament back. That night, as we walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were out of sync. I told myself he was saving something big for Christmas Day. He knew how much this time of year meant to me, surely. He was planning something special. Still, little moments chipped away at my confidence. I baked cookies to take to his office party, carefully decorating each one with little snowflakes and Christmas trees. When I handed them to him, he barely glanced at them before tossing the box into his bag. "Thanks," he said. "These will be great." I asked him one evening what his favorite Christmas tradition was. He shrugged and said, "We didn't really do much growing up. It was just another day." I remember trying to hide my disappointment. "Well," I said lightly, "this year will be different." The truth was, I wanted him to see Christmas the way I did. To feel what I felt. As the days crept closer to Christmas, I started to wonder if I was expecting too much. Maybe Jason just wasn't the kind of person who did grand gestures or got swept up in the holidays. Maybe I needed to let go of my expectations and accept the kind of love he offered, steady, practical, and reliable. And yet, a small part of me held on to hope. Christmas Day was coming. Surely, he knew how much it mattered to me. Surely, he'd planned something that showed he understood. I woke up on Christmas morning filled with hope. This was it, the moment everything would fall into place. I'd convinced myself that all the little things leading up to this day didn't matter. Jason knew me. He loved me. And today, he'd show me just how much. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of Christmas music playing in the background. Snow was falling gently outside, covering everything in a perfect, white stillness. The tree lights glowed warmly in the corner of the room, reflecting off the ornaments I'd carefully chosen. Jason walked in holding a box, neatly wrapped with the same paper we'd used for everyone else's gifts. My heart raced as he handed it to me. "Merry Christmas," he said, smiling, his calm, steady expression giving nothing away. I took the box from his hands, my fingers trembling slightly as I untied the ribbon. In that moment, I wanted so badly to feel understood. I wanted this to be the gesture that showed he truly saw me, the me who loved the magic of Christmas, the me who cherished traditions and moments that made life feel extraordinary. I peeled back the wrapping paper and opened the lid. Inside was a memory book. It was filled with photos of us from the past 6 months, pictures from our first dates, our weekend trips, quiet moments at home. On the last page was a letter. I picked it up and began to read. In the letter, Jason had outlined his plans for our future. It was practical, just like him. He wrote about saving for our honeymoon, where we'd live, and how he'd mapped out a financial plan to support the life we were building together. I stared at the book, at the photos, at the words he'd carefully chosen. I wanted to feel happy. I wanted to feel loved. Instead, I felt hollow. It was sweet, thoughtful. Everything about it was Jason, logical, steady, safe. But it wasn't what I needed. Jason looked at me, his smile soft, expectant. "Do you like it?" he asked. I tried to find the words, but my chest felt tight. The silence between us grew heavier. Finally, I managed to say, "It's nice." He frowned, his expression shifting slightly. "Nice," he repeated, confused. I swallowed hard, feeling tears prick the corners of my eyes. "This isn't about the gift," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about feeling like you know me. Like you understand why this day, why Christmas, means so much to me." Jason's face fell. For the first time, he looked genuinely hurt. "I do know you," he said quietly. I thought this would mean something. I didn't know how to explain it to him. The problem wasn't the gift itself, it was what it represented. Jason loved me the way he knew how, but it wasn't the way I needed. He saw the surface, but not the depth. I don't think you do, I said softly, the words breaking my own heart as I spoke them. Jason stood there, staring at me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. Jane, he said finally, I thought this would show you how much I care. I don't understand what I did wrong. And that was the hardest part. He didn't do anything wrong. He was just being himself. But in that moment, I realized that who he was and who I was might not fit together the way I thought they did. I looked around the room, at the lights I'd hung, the candles I'd lit, the little details I'd obsessed over to make this day special. All of it felt like a reflection of me, a version of love that Jason couldn't quite reach. I'm sorry, I whispered. I don't know what else to say. Jason didn't reply. He just nodded, his expression unreadable. And as I sat there, holding the memory book he'd put so much thought into, I felt an ache I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about the gift. It was about everything. All the little moments I'd brushed aside, the things I told myself didn't matter. I needed to feel seen, to feel understood. And in that moment, I realized Jason didn't see me the way I needed him to. I told myself I'd wait until the next day to figure out what to do. But deep down, I already knew. That was the moment everything changed. Click subscribe and remember to turn on notifications so you won't miss any future episode. That evening, I stood in the quiet of our bedroom, staring at the open suitcase on the bed. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of the tree lights from the living room. My clothes lay scattered around me, half folded, half forgotten, as if I couldn't quite bring myself to finish what I'd started. I kept telling myself to wait, to give it time, to let my emotions settle, but deep down, I already knew what I had to do. I thought about the memory book sitting on the coffee table, the photos of us smiling, holding hands, looking so much like the perfect couple. I thought about the letter Jason had written, full of practical plans for a life together that felt more like a blueprint than a dream. And then I thought about the look on his face when I told him I didn't feel seen. It wasn't anger or frustration, it was confusion. Like he couldn't understand why I didn't feel the same way he did, why his thoughtful gift hadn't bridged the gap between us. I packed slowly, almost mechanically. A sweater here, a pair of jeans there. I wasn't rushing. I think part of me was waiting for him to come in, to say something, to stop me. But he didn't. When I zipped up the suitcase, the sound echoed in the silence. I paused, standing there, waiting for some kind of sign, anything to make me stay. Jason was in the living room, sitting on the couch. He wasn't looking at the book anymore. He was staring at the window, at the snow falling quietly outside. I walked over to him, suitcase in hand, my heart pounding so loudly I thought he might hear it. Jason, I said softly. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. I need to go, I said, the words catching in my throat. For a moment, he didn't respond. He just looked at me, his eyes searching mine like he was trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said quietly. And that was it. He didn't stop me. Maybe he didn't know how. Or maybe he thought I needed the space, that I'd come back once I had time to think. I walked to the door, slipping on my coat and scarf, my fingers trembling as I tied the knot. My suitcase bumped against the hardwood floor as I rolled it behind me, the sound punctuating the heavy silence. When I opened the door, the cold hit me like a wall. Snowflakes drifted in the air, landing softly on the pavement outside. I turned back once, hoping, praying that he'd be there, that he'd say something, anything to make me stay. But Jason was still sitting on the couch, his head in his hands, unmoving. As I stepped outside, the snow crunched beneath my boots, the sound breaking the stillness of the night. I walked slowly, the cold air biting at my cheeks, my suitcase wheels leaving faint tracks in the snow. I wasn't sure if I was leaving him, or if I was leaving the disappointment. Every step I took felt heavier than the last. My mind raced with memories of us, our first date, our late-night talks, the way he used to hold my hand like he never wanted to let go. And yet, I couldn't ignore the ache in my chest, the feeling that no matter how much I loved him, we weren't enough. As I disappeared into the night, I told myself I was doing the right thing. That sometimes, walking away is the only way to find clarity. But deep down, I wondered if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. The days that followed were a blur. I stayed at a friend's apartment, surrounded by boxes of Christmas decorations and the faint smell of cinnamon candles. It was quiet there, too quiet. I had all the time in the world to think, and yet every time I tried, my mind became a whirlwind of emotions. I replayed Christmas morning over and over again. The weight of the memory book in my hands, Jason's confused expression, the silence that hung between us like a wall neither of us could break through. Was I asking for too much? Should I have told him what I wanted, spelled it out so there was no room for misunderstanding? But even as I thought that, another part of me pushed back. Shouldn't love be about understanding without words? Shouldn't the person who loves you the most just know? I felt like I was stuck in a loop, trying to justify what I'd done, trying to make sense of it all. My heart and my head were locked in a battle I couldn't win. Then one evening, as I sat by the window watching the snow fall, it hit me. Jason had been showing me love. I thought back to all the little things he'd done. The sticky notes on the fridge reminding me to drink water. The late-night coffee runs when I was buried under deadlines. The way he'd always make sure I had my favorite snacks in the pantry, even if he never ate them himself. He wasn't the kind of person who wrote songs or planned surprise trips. He didn't do grand gestures or dramatic displays of affection. Jason's love was quieter, more practical. It was in the way he always thought ahead, making sure our lives were secure and stable. It was in the way he tried to solve problems before they even arose, the way he cared in ways that weren't flashy but were deeply consistent. Maybe I hadn't failed to see it. Maybe I'd chosen not to. I started to realize that our disconnect wasn't just about him not understanding me. It was about me not fully understanding him, either. I'd wanted Jason to love me in the way I thought love should look, like my parents, like the movies, like the traditions I'd grown up believing in. But Jason loved me the way he knew how. And maybe, just maybe, I'd been too focused on what he wasn't to see what he was. Still, that didn't make the ache go away. Because love isn't just about intention. It's also about connection, about meeting each other in the middle. And the truth was, Jason and I weren't meeting. We were standing on opposite sides of a bridge we didn't know how to cross. As much as I missed him and God, I missed him, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something between us had broken. And I wasn't sure if it could be fixed. But for the first time, I also started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I'd given up too soon. Click subscribe and remember to turn on notifications so you won't miss any future episode. It had been a week since I left, though it felt so much longer. Every day I replayed our last moments together, wondering if I'd made the right choice. Was it fair to walk away without giving him or us a chance to fix things? One evening, just as the sun was setting, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my stomach tightened as I walked to answer it. It was Jason. He stood there in the cold, snowflakes clinging to his coat and hair. In his hands, he held a small box wrapped in paper, not the generic kind we'd used for everyone else's gifts, but a different pattern, with tiny snowflakes shimmering in silver. "Hi," he said softly, his breath visible in the cold air. I didn't know what to say. 100 emotions hit me all at once: relief, fear, longing. Before I could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, delicate. It was the glass snowflake ornament from the holiday market, the one I'd loved but put back on the shelf. "I went back for it," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I should have gotten it then, but I didn't understand. I'm sorry." My eyes filled with tears as I took the ornament from him. For a moment, I couldn't speak. "There's more," he said. He nodded toward the street. "Come with me." I hesitated, but something in his eyes made me follow him. Jason led me to the small bookstore where we'd first met. It looked different now, decorated with Christmas lights that twinkled softly in the windows. Inside, the space was empty, save for a table near the back. On the table was a book. Not the memory book from Christmas morning, but something new. "It's called Our Story So Far," Jason said, picking it up and placing it in my hands. I wanted to tell you how I see us, not just where we've been, but where we can go. If you'll let me. I opened the book, my fingers trembling. Inside were pages filled with photographs, handwritten notes, little pieces of our time together. But there were also blank pages, with a note at the end that said, "For everything still to come." My heart felt like it was breaking and healing at the same time. "I know I've made mistakes," Jason said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I know I'm not always the easiest person to love. But I'm trying, Jane. I want to keep trying. Because you're the person I see my future with. You're the person I want to figure this out with." For the first time, I realized just how much he'd been trying all along in his own way. I looked up at him, my vision blurred by tears, and I nodded. We sat there together, flipping through the pages, laughing at the photos and the memories they held. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of hope, like maybe we could rebuild what had felt so broken. Love isn't perfect. It's messy, confusing, and sometimes it breaks you. But when it's real, it's worth fighting for. Have you ever had a moment that made you question everything about your relationship? A time when love wasn't enough, or maybe when you found a way to make it work? Share your story below, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Love isn't always easy, it's messy and unpredictable, but it's something we all try to figure out. Share your own experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you've navigated the twists and turns of relationships.